Thank you for joining us for Voice of America's premiere of AIDS Living in the Shadows. I'm Ralph Robinson with VOA. The documentary's executive producer, Beth Mendelsohn, gave us a revealing look at the shame, the fear, the isolation, and misunderstanding still facing people with HIV. Beth is an award-winning producer who has been with VOA for nearly a decade. Challenging is how she described her initial efforts to get people to open up about the stigma of HIV. Beth's determination and unwavering commitment helped people share their stories so Beth could paint an intimate portrait of those still living in the shadows. Ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce to you my colleague, Beth Mendelsohn.
Thank you, Ralph. Voice of America is very fortunate today to have such a distinguished panel of experts all on the front lines of the HIV crisis and dealing with stigma, which is clearly a strong issue to be dealt with. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us today. Before I introduce the panelists, I would like to thank Sir Elton John for lending his support to this project and for giving a voice to those still living with this disease. Now to our panelists. Dr. Anthony Fauci is considered one of the world's leading immunologists on the subject of HIV/AIDS. His achievements in the field are numerous and include discoveries such as understanding of HIV's progression into AIDS, as well as the development of therapies with those living with the disease. He is currently the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases in the United States. Dr. Fauci also serves as an advisor to the U.S. government in the global AIDS epidemic. Dr. Julio Montana is the director of the British Columbia Center for Excellence in HIV/AIDS and a specialist in internal and respiratory diseases. A key leader in the development of highly active antiretroviral therapies, Montana plays a pivotal role in the future of HIV/AIDS treatment and prevention around the world. His current efforts include treatment to hard-to-reach HIV-positive communities, as well as working to reduce the amount of fatalities caused by HIV/AIDS through increased awareness and outreach. Afani Kelly Orazaliki is an HIV/AIDS and gay rights activist. He's based in Nigeria, and he has spoken out in criticism of Nigeria's anti-gay legislation that compromises the rights of homosexual and transgender men and women within the country. He is currently the executive director of International Center of Advocacy on the Right to Health, an NGO that provides counseling, medication, and other services for the LGBT community in Nigeria. Dr. James McIntyre is an expert on HIV/AIDS, women, pregnancy, and mother-to-child disease transmission. He is the current executive director of the Inova Health Institute, dedicated to providing health care in South Africa, with a particular focus on improving the lives of those affected with HIV/AIDS. Over the years, Dr. McIntyre's research has continued to gain international recognition, earning him a position as a consultant with the World Health Organization, UNAIDS, UNICEF, and as an advisor for the Elton John Foundation. Gentlemen, thank you so much. Thank you. One of the first questions on my mind, and I'm going to address this to you, Dr. Fauci, is to talk about the recent developments of the Mississippi baby. The baby, it's been making headlines around the world, and I wanted to get your sense of where we stand on this research and the baby.
Yes, of course. Well, the Mississippi baby, as probably a lot of people know, is a baby that was born in the state of Mississippi in the United States of a mother who had not had any antenatal care and therefore who was infected and therefore gave birth without having any antiretroviral therapy, which puts the baby at an extraordinarily high risk, from 25 to 35% transmissibility. The physicians involved, the pediatricians, Dr. Hannah Gay, made a decision at the time of the birth that, as opposed to assuming that the baby might be infected and waiting until they documented infection, and so not treat the baby aggressively immediately, they made the decision to treat the baby within 30 hours of infection. This was a good call because, as it turned out, the baby was infected. I meant between 30 hours following birth. Treatment was continued for 18 months, and then the baby was lost to follow-up, and then it became clear to the physicians that the baby, although the baby had not been on therapy for several months, no virus was able to be isolated. The baby was followed for several months, and it was felt that this might be perhaps the first cure of a baby, and that was widely disseminated information. As it turned out, in quite disappointing, but nonetheless, in some respects, not unexpected, the baby rebounded with virus 27 months after being off therapy. This is an important story because although it is a disappointment, the fact that the baby had 27 months without therapy and free of any rebound gives us some important questions to ask and some important challenges. But with regard to the subject matter of today, it's very important because I think it fits right into that. The mother did not have any antenatal care, and she was infected. In the United States, a developed nation, there is still, as shown on the film, even in the city that I live in, considerable stigma associated with it, some of which is very subtle, that prevents people from getting into the appropriate care at the appropriate time. So there's a lot of implications of that in the story that we told.
I wanted to now go to Dr. McIntyre and ask him, as a specialist in mother-to-child diseases, his take on the Mississippi baby story as it resonated around the world, how it impacts women who are looking to start families that are HIV positive.
I think I agree with Dr. Fauci. It's a disappointment. We see it as a setback, but it certainly it's given us a renewed commitment to try to work this through and work out how to achieve cure in young children. What we see in a setting such as the places I work in, Soweto in South Africa, is that we've managed to reduce the rate of mother-child transmission down from maybe 25% 20 years ago to less than 1%. So we know that we can do that if women access care. And in all of the settings, I think across Africa and the United States and many countries, what prevents women from coming forward for care is very often stigma. What prevents them from taking the drugs that can prevent transmission to their children is stigma, it's disclosure, it's going home with a big packet of pills and having to tell the family you live with that you're HIV positive. So I think that we've made remarkable medical progress, but we haven't always backed that up with the community interventions and the support interventions to reduce that stigma and enable people to take advantage of the medical advances.
Dr. Montana?
I think that it's important that people understand that every single baby born with HIV represents a system failure. And so, as Dr. Fauci was indicating, this is absolutely preventable. There is no reason why a child should be infected with HIV in this day and age. We have every tool to prevent that. And so the fundamental question is, what are we going to do to ensure that we deploy the tools that we have available so that this doesn't happen ever again? That goes beyond the Mississippi baby. That goes to the core of the question. We need to ensure that these services become available in a culturally and socially acceptable manner so that people can feel supported and encouraged to take advantage of this opportunity.
I'm going to switch topics, and I'm going to go to Afani. And I want to have him talk to us a little bit about what life is like for him on a daily basis living in Nigeria and the struggles that he has trying to get people taken care of, getting the medicine, and dealing with some of the hate crimes that were reflected in the film.
Thanks very much, Beth. I don't even know how to go about it, but it's incredibly amazing how we have lived through the work that we do in Nigeria and how we have been able to survive in terms of ensuring that people have access to healthcare services and access to social justice, because living by the day gets more scarier than it was the previous day. Investigating the story that you saw, wasn't easy for us to go through, because when it happened, I was the one who went up at 4 a.m. in the morning and to rescue some of the victims, and saw how brutal people could be just because of who we love or just because of who we are. And I keep saying to myself, we can't stop. We can't go back. We have lost a lot of people because of this, even though the government says it doesn't affect access to services. But that's not true. We are the ones who live in this horrible situation. We are the ones who live in this scary moment of our lives every day. We are the foot soldiers that does this on every day of our life, so we can actually tell what it feels like and how, with little or no support, we have been able to get through this every day of our life. Life has not been easy to see people who are scared even to go to healthcare facilities because of stigma and discrimination, because of the laws that has been put forward before us. And you sit back and say it doesn't affect service provision. Meanwhile, the law, the content of the law is different from the title of the law, which criminalizes aiding and abetting, which criminalizes freedom of association. So how do you want to interpret that? But all the same, that is also the source of my inspiration, knowing that a lot of people are scared to access services, knowing that a lot of people would rather die in their homes than risk their life to die in prison. So it's barbaric. If we had shown the proper picture of some of the people who were attacked, people were beaten, people were thrown out of their houses at the middle of the night when they are supposed to be sleeping, all in the name that they are perceived to be gay. And my question is, even if they are gay, has it affected you as a person?
I'm going to continue talking about stigma, and I want to direct this to Dr. Julio Montana, who was responsible and one of the leaders in establishing the supervised injection facility in Vancouver called Insight. And I want to talk to him about if stigma is being broken down because people are able to openly get treatment for being HIV positive. Dr. Montana?
Well, when it comes to the struggle of people who use drugs, very early on we recognized that the promise of antiretroviral therapy in particular and other prevention strategies could not be fulfilled unless we had an opportunity to engage people on a productive conversation around their health. And living in an environment where the use of drugs was criminalized was interfering with our ability to establish that conversation. And so as a result of an epidemic of overdose death in the city of Vancouver, we were able to convince the government to take a more proactive approach. And on a research basis, we opened the supervised injection site, which actually proved to be life-saving and radically changed our ability to engage this patient population in much more productive healthcare interventions, to the point that today we have virtually eliminated HIV in the injection drug using community in the city of Vancouver and the province of British Columbia. Now, having said that, we have been able to maintain the site despite the continued opposition of the federal government through legal intervention, all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada, which ruled that this was an essential service that should be maintained. Yet, despite that, the federal government has managed to interfere with the desire of the city of Vancouver and other cities across Canada to open other sites. through a nightmare of bureaucratic procedures that they have put in place, demonstrating that stigma and discrimination at the highest level remains well entrenched, and that we need to remain very vigilant and active in this front if we're going to overcome it.
I'm going to address this now to Dr. Fauci and ask, what role can national governments play in reducing HIV/AIDS both within their country but also worldwide?
Are you referring specifically to the stigma aspect? Because that's the general question.
Let's keep it to stigma, yes.
Okay, so I think we can give just a very cogent example of support for the community aspects of getting people to freely access care. In the United States, for example, we have 12% African Americans, and 55% of all the new infections are among African Americans, and 65% of all infections among women are among African American women. And right from the beginning, and unfortunately even to the present day, the degree of stigma of African American gay men clearly is disproportionately greater than the stigma associated with being gay in the Caucasian population in the United States. And I think that's something that not only is government needs to get involved with, but this is something at the level of the community and the clergy and the people who can go out and reduce that stigma, because the idea of accessing care, of accessing counseling is much, much more difficult. And it's very interesting and disturbing that there's the egregious legal type of stigma that Ifeanyi has described, which is clearly obvious. And then there's the very subtle kind of insidious stigma that people don't even realize exists, that keeps people out of the access of care, and when you get access of care not being readily available to you, you don't get tested, you don't get treated if you're infected, and you get all of the cascade of negative effects that we're all trying to avoid from not only not having treatment for your own illness, but not bringing viral load down to below detectable levels so that you won't infect somebody else, of not getting a pregnant woman into care so that a child would not be infected. So stigma permeates, but it does it in a way that's quite subtle and in many cases not even noticed.
Dr. McIntyre, the Elton John Foundation has long been involved in stigma as it relates to being HIV positive. Do you think the impact of the documentary Living in the Shadows will be positive, or how it will resonate with those who have the disease?
I certainly think it will. It's a problem that's been with us all the way through this epidemic, but it's something that certainly hasn't gone away. The Elton John AIDS Foundation in the UK has made stigma, I think, the cornerstone of the projects that they've been supporting, and will continue to do so. And you've heard Elton speak out very strongly in this film and in a number of public appearances about this. We're about to launch with the Elton John Foundation a large program in South Africa for prevention for men who have sex with men, which will focus on working with communities and working to communicate across communities, not only to men who have sex with men, but to their families and their communities as well. We're lucky we can do that in a South African setting where we don't have the legal challenges that happen in so many other places in Africa. So I believe that this kind of program, telling the stories of the brave people that we've seen here today, is essential in raising that community awareness, that public awareness, not least in politicians, as we go forward.
Doctor, I want to follow up and ask you about the obstacles South Africa faces, specifically in the battle against HIV and AIDS, if you could address that.
South Africa still has a huge problem with HIV and AIDS. We have among the largest population of people living with HIV. We've made remarkable strides as a country in the past few years, with now more than 2 million people receiving antiretroviral treatment. And that's against a background, if you think back just 5 or 6 years ago, of a government that was in denial about HIV and which didn't believe that it even existed. So I think what we've seen is a complete turnaround in political will, a turnaround in service provision. Much of that has been made possible through large donors, and especially through the PEPFAR program, which has been able to drive those services. But the real battle is stopping new infections. The new infections continue, particularly in young women, particularly in men who have sex with men, particularly in stigmatized populations all over South Africa who don't have access to healthcare, don't have access to information. So if we come back into the same wheel, if we're going to really get in and eliminate this epidemic, we have to address stigma as well as medical aspects.
Afani, I want to go back to you and talk about anti-gay legislations in Nigeria, Uganda, and basically if you could talk about the situation all through Africa as you see it.
Well, the situation, or will I say the cultural and religious environment in Africa doesn't, apart from South Africa, as we all know, doesn't allow gay people to express themselves freely, no matter who they love or who they are with. And it's hilarious, I would say, to want to dictate to people how they are going to live their life, rather than looking at the welfare of people as against who they love. In terms of ensuring access to services and also social justice, is difficult. You can't report a case of violation based on your sexual orientation or gender identity. Specifically in Nigeria, you can go to 14 years imprisonment for being gay, and you get up to 10 years imprisonment for aiding and abetting. How do you describe that? How does that encourage people to seek access to seek services? How do you, if you say we want an HIV/AIDS free generation, like I have said before, then we need everybody involved. We need everyone. We need the drivers of the epidemic involved in this process. We can't achieve this without engaging the key affected population in this process. We can't achieve this with all the anti-gay laws that we have around Africa, particularly countries who have come forward to create a law on top of the pre-colonial laws that we already have existing in our laws, Nigeria and Uganda, to be precise. You cannot eat your cake and have it back. You cannot criminalize people on one hand and come back on the other hand and say, oh, it doesn't affect access to services. That's not true. We can't play politics with people's life. And that is what our African government is clearly doing. They are trying to tell us that morality lies in who we love and doesn't lie in corruption and doesn't lie in insurgency that is sweeping around all over Africa as it stands right now. But what is much more important to our government is to criminalize people for who they are. People who have no harm in the national security. So it's actually very important that we take a holistic look at this once again, and I will keep calling on the African government. We can't play politics with people's life, because we are all people affected and infected by this issue. If you think that the gay man you want to punish is that one on the street, don't forget that it could be your son, it could be your daughter, it could be the breadwinner of your family. So being gay does not have anything to morality. We should get that clear. I'm a Christian, and when I hear religious leaders preach hate from the pulpit in churches and in mosques, and I wonder, the same God that we talk about, where is the love of God in our hearts? Where does it lie in our hearts? If we want to kill people, if we want to punish people for who they love or who they are, we can only achieve HIV/AIDS free generation when we have equality. when we promote healthcare across board, which is very key. If we want to get rid of new infections amongst key affected population, we should be able to promote access to services without fear or favor. We cannot criminalize people on one hand and call them on the other hand, because nobody's going to come. Nobody will show up. It takes the ones who are brave to show up. People don't want to die in prison. That is why people would rather die in the comfort of their home. And that is not what we want. Because also, given the cultural and the religious environment has also forced a lot of gay men into the family way. So you have them living a double standard life. How do you deal with that? And we're talking about women and children here. This also affects the general population.
Dr. Montana, Richard Keith was our profile in the story about Vancouver, and he says in his interview that taking medication, and he's healthy, he's living a very healthy life right now for someone who's HIV positive. What's the message for those who are currently living with AIDS about how they can live a healthy life and the prognosis as you see it?
Well, I think that we have really been extremely fortunate that antiretroviral therapy has been so successful that virtually has eliminated the chances of progression to AIDS, premature death, and we now know it virtually eliminates the likelihood of HIV transmission. So it doesn't get any better. In the absence of a cure or a preventive vaccine, as Dr. Fauci said yesterday, this is the closest we can get to solving the problem. And the only way we can fully realize the promise of antiretroviral therapy and deliver on the 90-90 strategy that Michelle Sidibe unveiled earlier this week as the cornerstone for ending the AIDS pandemic as we know it, is to really deal with the stigma, the discrimination, the persecution, the prosecution, the criminalization, all of the factors that, as we heard, not only in Africa but in the rest of the world, are making it impossible at times for people to avail themselves of the services that they need to protect themselves and protect their families. So when we talk about the 90-90-90, there is a fourth 90. We need to decrease the stigma and discrimination by at least 90% if we are going to be able to fully deliver on the promise of our strategy.
Dr. Fauci, I want to ask you to talk about the advancement in treatment options and what you see in the next few years that could solve this problem. The shots versus having to take the pills every day. Could you advise us about what's happening with that?
Sure. As Dr. Montaner said, we have an extraordinarily positive situation where we have drugs now that can, if taken properly and consistently, can get the viral load to below detectable level with the twofold winner of saving life and preventing transmission. Years ago, when the drugs were first developed, when we had triple combinations, they were usually in multiple pills multiple times a day. And although the effect was very favorable, it was disturbing of lifestyle to have to take pills around the clock. And over the years, the regimens became much more simple, so that now we have a couple of options of one pill with multiple drugs in a pill, which makes it easier to take and makes the adherence much better. But still, no one likes to take a drug or even a combination of drugs every day. So the advances in therapeutic approaches follow a couple of tracks. One is better drugs with less toxicity that have the same effect. But the other is the development of longer-acting drugs that would not necessarily require taking a pill or pills every single day. And that's something that I think has enormous potential, not only for the treatment of already established HIV infection, where optimally you'd like to see someone who could come in for an injection once every several months and treat it, but it also has implications for pre-exposure prophylaxis. Because although we know that, again, if taken appropriately and properly, daily Truvada can actually decrease the likelihood of getting infected by over 90%. The difficulty with those trials and the implementation of them are that people often don't take the pill every day, and when you look at the entire study, the efficacy is as low as 40+% in the IPREC study. If we can get people conveniently to have a long-acting drug, then I think we'll have the double advantage of both treatment and prevention. And Beth, that's where the research is headed for right now.
That was one of the themes that came up with all the people we spoke to. Everyone talked about taking the pills, and one young man, Christian Page Bass, said that the pills will be the death of me. Right. He said there were so many pills to take that he saw his mother taking those pills and said, I don't think I can do that again. And with everybody we spoke to, the issue of taking pills seems to really be quite difficult for everyone with HIV/AIDS. Okay. I wanted to follow up and ask Dr. Montana, in his work in Vancouver, what he sees as the future for Insight. Do you see it moving forward, and do you see it spreading throughout other countries? I know it's in Europe, but do you see it happening in North America?
I'll ask Tony that question. The Canadian experience has been quite frustrating because we have had the unwavering support of the province of British Columbia across the Parliament. This is a non-partisan issue in the West Coast. There is 100% support, and the government actually has championed this issue and has seen the benefits of it, both in terms of health and in economic terms. And so they are quite supportive of our work, and they're quite willing to support the expansion of this activity. In fact, we have several semi-clandestine injection sites currently operating in the province, which are not being persecuted or prosecuted by the province. However, the federal government, as I said, continues to fight this, and the Honorable Rona Ambrose, who is here at the conference, our Minister of Health, went as far as trying to stop our medicalized heroin program, actually attempting to discontinue the successful use of this strategy in patients who are enrolled in this kind of research because of their preconceived notions regarding this kind of an approach, despite the evidence to the contrary and the efficacy evidence that we have been able to generate. So the message is that not always evidence will be sufficient to mobilize the political leadership in the right direction. And what we need, as we learned throughout the AIDS epidemic, is for those of us that have the opportunity to become vocal and focus on trying to change the mindset so that these activities can spread throughout the country, the region, and hopefully the world. But don't underestimate how difficult this is. It's been a very, very tough battle, despite the support of the Supreme Court of Canada.
Dr. McIntyre, I want to go back to you and talk about having HIV/AIDS, how it impacts a woman, their life, their home, and their community in South Africa. You can talk a little bit about that.
We talk about women with HIV in South Africa. We're talking such a large proportion of the community. So in childbearing ages, about 20 to 30% of women have HIV. In any antenatal clinic that you go into, 30% plus of those women will have HIV. So this is something that's become a huge part of everybody's life. Treatment is now available, but it still means, as we've heard, having to go to a clinic, spend a whole day at a clinic, sometimes once a month, just to pick up pills. If you have a child on treatment, you may have to take them to a different clinic. So there's an awful lot that needs to be done to streamline the approaches that we have for those on treatment. We also know that young women in particular in South Africa are at huge risk. The incidence is highest in women, young girls and women of 16 to 24 in that age group. And interventions to deal with women of 18, 19 who have left school, who are not easy to reach, don't really exist. And they often have no job. They have so they have to rely on men for somewhere to live, they have to rely on men for money to live. And so we see a lot of transactional sex which really becomes survival tactics. So there's a lot of social upliftment that has to go on for huge numbers of young girls in South Africa if we're about to protect them from HIV. And there's been some very interesting approaches to doing that. But we have a long way to go, both in prevention and in providing treatment.
Afani, I want to go back to you and talk a little bit more about Nigeria. In the film, Roger Ross Williams, the filmmaker from God Loves Uganda, makes a case that American evangelicals have had an influence on public policy in Nigeria and other African countries. Many evangelicals would disagree with that. Being on the ground in Nigeria, what's your perspective on that?
Well, this question has come across several times to me, and I keep saying to people that, it has to do within the context. As publicly as it's been displayed in Uganda, it also might be a bit tricky for Nigeria. Well, yes, Nigeria is a very religious country with multiple religion, and then also multiple, as the case may be, for Nigeria, the evangelical missionaries might be there, but couldn't also be as vocal as they are in Uganda. In Uganda, we've seen the public show of the evangelical mission in Uganda. In Nigeria, the case is different. Even though the religious leaders have also played a key role in terms of ensuring that the bill was passed. And also, if you look at the precedent between the signing of the two different bills in Nigeria and Uganda, the Ugandan one was signed publicly by President Museveni. The one for Nigeria was signed behind closed doors, and we didn't get to know about it until the 7th day. So it took us another week. In fact, the information was leaked. If not, it was set to remain secret, and people wouldn't have known that bill was signed. So there are two different things, because Nigeria is highly religious and can also do not want to be seen as being pushed into taking decisions or doing things that are being motivated by other people. So even if they are taking a lead, they want to be the one in the forefront to take a decision for themselves. So that is what I have seen in the case of Nigeria with regards to the evangelical mission. But what I can tell you clearly for the Nigerian case is that the religious leaders played a major role in terms of, because we also have heard both the bishops and the imams come out openly on national televisions to say we support the criminalization of same-sex people. And when the bill was passed, when it became an act, people, mostly religious leaders, congratulated the president. But for us, we felt also this won't last for too long. You can only praise the president for just the singular act, but there are also a lot more issues that are on ground that needs to be dealt with, that within a short period of time, people will actually forget that there is a law that prohibits same-sex relationships or activities in Nigeria. And as the case may be, the case of the girls, the adopted girls, took over the space, and they went back also calling the government a failed government. So if you want to use same-sex loving people to salvage your situation or to buy cheap popularity, it can only last for a while. It will never last forever. And the same thing is happening in Uganda, as we will see, because they are now coming back to say, we are only doing this to protect children, we are only doing this to protect this and that. But this is just because donors are beginning to put strict measures before they can give out their money to you. There are things you need to achieve. And like I said before, our government wants to eat their cake and have it back. So all in the name you want to get the resources to continue in your embezzlement and your corruption, you still come out in public to say, oh, this does not affect this. How do you try to balance that? So I also keep saying to donors, look, this goes beyond. I don't believe in giving it conditionality because it also affects everybody, even the gay people who we are trying to protect. But we need to look at a holistic approach to this effect. I am a human rights activist. I can't say I only speak for gay people, but I speak out against human rights violation of all forms and all kinds. And these are the things that we're asking donors to do. If there is an adoption of a journalist or of different population, we should be able to speak out about it. In Africa, we don't have very good human rights precedents. Take a look at what has happened in South Africa. Yes, they have a very good law, but also there's always creative rape that we have seen all over and all over again. So we need to be able to deal with this issue holistically to ensure that we all achieve a maximum impact in terms of ending human rights violation around Africa.
Dr. Montana, can you talk a little bit about the disclosure issues in Canada and the discrimination against people there?
I don't know to what extent people are aware, but there are laws in Canada that criminalize the exposure to HIV to the extent that there is an undue burden being put on the shoulders of people infected with HIV when it comes to HIV disclosure. Just to make this graphic, I have had calls from the RCMP, the police force in Canada, at a given point several times, where they are asking for information on a given patient, which we are very reluctant to share, and typically we've been able to avoid sharing. But they are actually requesting information regarding viral load and antiretroviral therapy use, etc., in the circumstance of a person that had a consensual sexual relationship sometime in the distant past, whereby the partner, heterosexual or homosexual, it doesn't really matter, was potentially exposed to HIV, and yet we know that the HIV transmission did not occur, and there was no discussion about HIV at the time. The patient may have used a condom or may have been undetectable with the use of antiretroviral therapy, in which case the likelihood of transmission is on top of that very, very small, and yet there is this ability based on the law to retrospectively charge the person with aggravated assault, which carries a penalty of 10 years in prison, in the absence of HIV transmission, simply because there was a potential exposure and there was no preemptive, so to speak, disclosure of the HIV status. As a former colleague of mine, a public health official that was responsible for the city of Vancouver, told me many years ago, it takes two to tango, and if there was a consensual relationship, this is a matter that should stay within the couple, and there is no business on the part of the government to get involved or the criminal law, unless there would have been rape or some other thing that is addressed by the law regardless. So this creates a serious problem because in the context of our attempts to normalize HIV testing, now we have this added burden where we have to explain to people that, by the way, knowing your HIV status will carry this additional potential criminal burden that is inappropriate and not justified by the evidence. The current law in Canada demands that the only circumstance in which you are entitled not to disclose your HIV status in that setting is if you are both at the same time undetectable, biologically speaking, and wearing a condom, which is really unnecessary and inappropriate.
As we're coming to the end of our time, I want to go through and ask the panel, everybody to respond to this. What's the most important thing to convey about HIV/AIDS to the next generation? I'll start with you, Dr. Fauci.
I think for the next generation is that we can, if we all cooperate in doing the things that we've been discussing at this meeting, we can actually end the HIV/AIDS pandemic. This is something that's durable. It's not a fantasy. It requires a multifactorial approach, multidimensional. It requires getting people into testing, into care, retained in care, on therapy, if they need it, which most people do, now that we treat people essentially who have viremia as opposed to worrying about levels of CD4 count, that the future generation can look forward to a AIDS-free world. And we require the cooperation and involvement of the next generation to be aware of how we can do that. And eliminating stigma is one of those obstacles. You know, there are scientific challenges and scientific obstacles that we need to overcome, vaccine, cure, etc. But there are some obstacles, such as stigma, that would be very important if we move to get us to that AIDS-free generation, a world without AIDS. That would be much, much, much more expedited if we did not have stigma.
Dr. Martino?
Yeah, I think I would basically restate what Dr. Fauci has said. We have the opportunity to end the AIDS pandemic as we know it during our lifetime. And we have the roadmap, and we know how to do it. The question is whether we have the political will to do it, the political will to finance it, and the political will to remove the stigma in our society at large, globally. The stigma, discrimination, persecution, prosecution, and criminalization that are making our jobs so much more difficult and ultimately may compromise our ability to deliver on the promise of what is otherwise a very appealing proposition.
I will also speak from the community's perspective. We need to listen to the community. We need to engage the community. The community is asking for decriminalization to enable them have access to quality healthcare services, to equal healthcare services. We need to engage all the communities involved. Men who have sex with men, transgender people, sex workers, drug users. We need to engage women, children. We need to engage everybody. We need to listen to the community and put to action what the community has requested to see happen, to be able to end HIV and AIDS, and also decriminalize stigma and discrimination across board. Thank you.
I think the next generation, if you will, has the opportunity to see a world without AIDS, but our message has to be that will only happen if, in the words of this conference, nobody's left behind. We're not going to end this epidemic if we don't work with groups that are currently stigmatized and are currently affected so much by HIV, whether it's men who have sex with men, whether it's drug users, whether it's young girls who are preyed upon by older men. So I think that the next generation has the ability to move past the stigma of their parents, I hope. We see it in many other ways, but we need to maintain that hope that a generation can look past the previous politics, can look past the previous stigma, and can use all of these new tools at their disposal to end the AIDS epidemic.
Can each of you talk about, as physicians and activists, how you've been impacted by stigma in terms of funding, lack of funding, access to more money to make a difference in this disease? How do you feel about that? Are you still dealing with stigma?
Well, it's less now than it was in the beginning. I think one of the things that the stigma associated with the perfect storm of disenfranchisement when the emerging epidemic was first noted, first among the gay population, and then injection drug users and commercial sex workers. There was that subtle stigma that I told you about, not a law, not a putting anyone in jail, but just the idea of considering something the problem of disenfranchised population. And I think that led to not getting the head start and the jump on the pandemic in the early years, because if we had had the open, free discussion of why this is not, the enemy is not the infected person, the enemy is not the population involved, the enemy is the virus. We're much, much, much better now than we were then, but I think we could have gotten a better head start on it. And I think stigma, subtle, subliminal type stigma was influential.
I think that, as you heard, things have evolved in our environment significantly over the last 3 decades. Yet we suffer stigma by association. I don't see too many times when my friend, who is a cardiologist, gets asked, why do you do this work? What motivates you to do this work? Why are you so passionate about it? I mean, people accept that being a cardiologist, you're supposed to be passionate about cardiac disease. But we ask that all the time. How the hell do you care about people who use drugs? And this and that and the other thing. And my children actually tell me that, their friends ask them, how do you get involved in this? How do you get to care about this stuff? And so I think that this is something that we palpate all the time. I remember my youngest daughter coming home one day many years ago, and one of her best friends said, I don't think I can go to your place for dinner anymore. You people talk about all this yucky stuff, and I just don't know what I'm thinking. This is, like Tony's describing, subtle forms of stigma and discrimination that most people don't even think about. But as I said, it's a stigma by association, and we need to educate people that this is not acceptable. It's simply, we need to get rid of it.
I think after suffering stigma from my first job before I became an activist, losing my job because of my sexual orientation, I realized that stigma and discrimination is actually a huge thing and can cause a lot to us, and we need to put our money where our mouth is. We can't say it all, and when it's time, we need to invest in dealing with stigma and discrimination. It's not enough to say we are against stigma and discrimination, and yet we don't put in enough resources. Speaking from the African context, there is not enough resources yet. We need to empower local organizations to be able to win the hearts of the people. If we're able to win the hearts of the people, the government becomes an easy task for all of us, because people are still struggling to understand what stigma and discrimination means. People do not understand that being gay goes beyond having sex. People do not understand the emotional trauma that people go through because of who they are. So we need to invest in dealing and eradicating stigma and discrimination if we really want to make a headway. It's not enough to say it alone, but also to invest and put in resources and empower local organizations who are actually the foot soldiers of this war that we are talking about. A lot of us sit behind our computers in Washington, in the US, in Canada, in wherever it is we are, and we make decisions, and we say we want to eradicate stigma and discrimination, and yet we leave the local organizations who are the foot bearers of all this.
I think that we in South Africa lived through a number of dark years of discrimination against HIV organizations when we had a government leadership that didn't believe in the virus for various reasons, many of which I think were related exactly to the kind of stigma that we've been talking about. And we've changed that around, and we've seen a remarkable turnaround. But to some extent it still exists. It's very acceptable to run a clinic for pregnant HIV-positive women. It's not quite so acceptable to try and put services for MSN into a government clinic in a rural area. So the fight continues, not perhaps on the grand scale that we had to during the Mbeki years, but that fight does still continue. And I think one of the reasons that we managed to get through that was the huge support from the international community and the international scientific community. including people on this panel, who kept coming back to South Africa with the resources and with the science to fight against stigma, with the information that we could use, the knowledge we could use to fight against that institutionalized stigma in the country. I think that we will have the responsibility to continue to do that now, especially for our colleagues in Uganda and Nigeria and in other countries where this is raising its head again.
We end our documentary with a story about hope, about a young man who is now being successfully treated, who's HIV positive. And I guess as we wrap up, if each of you could briefly talk about what your message is to Melbourne, what you think is the message of hope for treating HIV/AIDS.
Well, the message is that we have the tools right now, and we need to implement, we need to be inclusive, as we've said many times on the panel, to leave no one behind, to get the tools that we have to the people who need them. So the message here is everyone is talking about what the ultimate goal is, and it is a realistic goal, as we've all said many times, is getting that deflection curve so that we can be realistically thinking of the end of the HIV/AIDS pandemic as we know it today. And I think this conference here in Melbourne and what we've heard from people from so many different perspectives, I think underscores that that is truly a feasible and attainable goal.
I don't think I can add a whole lot more to what Dr. Fauci has said. I'd like to emphasize that we are at a real tipping point in our ability to control and eventually see the end of this pandemic. We are approaching the year 2015 where the MDGs come to an end. We need new, bold and ambitious goals if we're going to get there. UNAIDS has proposed the so-called 90-90-90 strategy, which calls for 90% of people living with HIV globally to be tested, 90% on treatment, and 90% biologically suppressed. We can't get there if we deliver on the promise of antiretroviral therapy and combination prevention. We cannot afford not to do it.
Yeah, I think it's important that we put more emphasis on test and treat. If we can make a headway with test and treat, and also not only looking at test and treat, but also look at sustainable ways of achieving this. I'm sure if we take this as a message from Melbourne, I'm sure by 2016 we'll come back with a successful story. Thank you.
I think the message is that this is something that can be achieved across the world. This is not just an end to an epidemic in the United States or Canada. If we use these tools, we use them properly with proper political and donor support, we can achieve this right across the world, and that's what we'll hope to see by 2016.
I'd like to thank our esteemed colleagues and physicians and activists for joining us today, and we appreciate you taking the time to listen, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.